Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Marketing Mischief and Mayhem. My name is Russell Quinan. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Theory SF in San Francisco. We're an agency, performance marketing brand agency for ambitious brands. And we've been having great conversations with our clients and friends in the industry about what's really happening in the trenches of marketing. And today I'm very excited for my guest. Okay, here it comes, Robyn. She is someone who has survived and thrived inside of one of the most complex marketing machines on earth, Verizon. Robyn Parks has spent nearly 2 decades navigating everything from pricing strategy and product launches to retail design, digital sales, AI, growth, and national brand accountability. She's run local markets, national campaigns, segmentation strategies, and demand engines, all while balancing creativity and the occasional, wait, legal said what? In other words, if modern marketing were an endurance sport, Robyn would have multiple medals, a hydration strategy, and strong opinions about which metrics actually matter. Today we're talking strategy, creativity, scale, and what it takes to make bold ideas survive inside of big organizations. Welcome to the show, Robyn.
Thanks so much, Russell. I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. Well, hey, as we always do, we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. And my first question for you, Robyn, is when you're marketing at massive scale, what's harder, being bold or getting out of your own way?
Yeah, it's a great question, Russ. I would say, look, at a big brand, you always want to be bold because you're always trying to stand out and lead the pack, but it is difficult to get out of your own way, particularly because when you're in a highly matrix organization, there are so many opinions, so many varying responsibilities, and everyone is trying to do the right thing, but inevitably it could cause us to take a step maybe backwards to the side of what we were trying to do as it relates to being.
Yeah, and that's the funny part. And we say to our clients, because so many people, we like to have a whole group committee come in and look at the creative or look at strategy. And, one of my favorite quotes was, there was no committee behind Michelangelo doing any of his work, right?
So true.
And the other quote I like is, what was that? A horse designed by committee will be a camel.
Yeah.
Right?
Look, all of a sudden everybody becomes a creative, right?
Everybody's a creative, everybody's an expert. And I don't like yellow.
Yeah.
I had a childhood trauma and yellow bugs me, right? So it's such a hard process, and to be successful in that environment means you're very diplomatic, but hopefully able to rein in all the cats, right? And have them all march the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, opinions are great, and it's helpful to the creative process to really understand how people are reacting because it may reflect how your customers react. But ultimately, there has to be a clear decision maker on when you're going to just go forward.
Yeah. When I was launching a global brand a few years back for a major computer company, one of the things that we did that I thought was really smart that my client at the time had us do was we went and had individual meetings with all of the decision makers that were going to be in that room for the final approval. And we actually went one by one into each one to individually show the work, to tell them the strategy, why we believe it works, to take their advice, to get some comments and so forth. So they all felt they had a stake in it now. It wasn't just up for a yay or a nay. It was, they've had a meeting, we've been there on the side, we talked, and that was one of the strategies that we had for always getting our work approved. It's a longer process.
Yeah.
But I think it's a pretty critical one to make folks take ownership of the work and to feel connected to it rather than just trying to, shoot arrows at it at the approval meeting, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a very respectful process because people get to contribute, their feedback is valued. They feel heard, but it also helps, to your point, on the person who's trying to shop the work, because then you don't have a groupthink dynamic, and you're not just sort of building off of each other's criticisms. You're really looking inside and taking your own area of expertise or responsibility, and you're giving a little bit more of a, I think, focused feedback when you do that way.
Awesome. Well, hopefully we do more of that. So let me ask you, in highly rational categories, plans, pricing, performance, where does emotion actually get permission to show up? And where is it still quietly banned?
Yeah, look, I think when you're dealing with a complex product or a subscription service, you do have a responsibility to the customer to be clear and provide transparent disclosure. And sometimes that can be overwhelming and maybe not feel as exciting. But I think it's up to the marketers in the room to be able to build a connection throughout the process. A lot of times we focus a lot on the upfront piece and how do you originally acquire the customer, but brand building takes place over time. And you really have to maintain your commitment to the customer that you sell up front with actually paying back the dream over time. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to innovate in the relationship and the emotion associated with what might otherwise be viewed as transactional after you get past the initial point of purchase.
So do you feel the emotional part of communications of that initial work, is it really more on the acquisition side, on the demand gen side, and kind of breaking through at the awareness level, and then we kind of get into the more transactional communications as folks are checking boxes and checking prices?
Yeah, I think so. I think you have to grab people's attention, and if you're not doing that with emotion in the front end, you've kind of lost before you started. But I really do think there's a place for emotion, done the right way, downstream as well in the transactional process. It doesn't have to feel so standoffish or overwhelming, which I think it can very easily become when you're in a highly regulated industry.
Yeah, I was going to say, is there a chance that we could start to see that in that sales process, right, where folks are checking the boxes? And I kind of liken it to the first time I saw an airline actually do something cool with that video that everybody has to watch right before the plane takes off.
Yeah.
It might have been Virgin Airlines, where people are dancing and there's humor and stuff is happening. And it was actually really fun to watch versus here are your exits and here's how you close your seatbelt, right? It feels like there is an opportunity, but it would be a pretty bold brand. And that would be, the CMO or the VP of marketing, somebody like yourself trying to sell that through. I would love to be in that meeting to watch how you wrangle that crew to make that happen.
Yeah. It's definitely something that's different. I think it takes a bold move, but how impactful that was, right? For you to remember it on something that was very routine, very mundane. And I think the trick shot is making sure you're doing it in a way that doesn't compromise the original intent of the piece, right? Like you still have to get the critical information, the facts are the facts, but how do you do it in a way that actually engages the attention versus becomes white noise, right?
Yeah, they're totally. And there's a brand that I loved when they launched. They launched actually, they had an agency here in San Francisco. It was Mini Cooper when they launched, and they took the owner's manual, which most people don't even read, but they turned it into actually a really fun little book to read of how to play with your car and interesting uses of things you wouldn't even think about. For instance, one of them was opening the trunk hood, turning your headlights on. You can open your trunk hood to shine the lights up, right? If you want to see your cat in the tree.
Yeah.
Like kind of crazy stuff like that. That was just so fun at a brand experience level.
Make your own bat signal.
Yeah, exactly. It was a kind of a bat signal, and I'm waiting for more brands to kind of do that, hopefully. And again, we're trying to push that pendulum back into brand marketing, especially in tech, to start having some great experiences with our users beyond just getting them to sign up and pay money, right?
Yeah, and that's when you really unleash the user. I think that's the power of the creator economy is it's people using the brand stuff and defining it for themselves, and opposed to the brand being the sole, definer of the brand and how the use cases, right, of your product.
Totally. So everyone says, well, hopefully everyone says, strategy fuels creativity. In practice, it often handcuffs it. So what does good strategy actually do to make creativity braver instead of safer?
So to me, a really great strategy has a very defined objective and a very defined set of outcomes. But the how in the middle is where you have room to play. And I think if you're overly prescriptive on the how, you really do hamper the creativity across all parts of the strategy, whether that's operational or creative in nature. But if you can have a common, well understood objective and a clear set of outcomes that you want to measure yourself against, then you can really allow people to contribute creatively on the middle.
Right. I've worked at highly creative agencies throughout my career, and I've been on the very strategic agencies where we have like 2.5-page briefs, which is not a brief at all.
Not a brief.
And then I've been at very creative agencies where the brief is very brief, like almost a half a page, because we didn't want to hamper anybody's freedom to think or to roam, right? To make the swim lane too small. We wanted to make it as wide as possible because you know what? We might see something we never would have expected.
That's right.
And if we give people that kind of latitude, then we at least we're having a chance to see something, right? Versus something so, as you said, prescriptive, so right down the middle. And I would often really love those creative presentations because I would never know what I was about to see. And I always thought that was really great. And at least it gave us a chance to swing for the fences, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's funny, when we were talking offline, you mentioned what is a word I would ban, and brief was immediately the word that I thought of, because there, 8 pages does not make a brief, right? So I'm all for, focused fact pack so that we're anchored, but it does not replace the power of a conversation, meeting of the minds, and then an opportunity to really innovate in the middle. So I think that's where the best creative happens.
Absolutely. So you've led national brand, local markets, retail, digital, and growth. Boy, that's a lot of work. If you could only optimize one of those for the next 5 years, which one truly moves the needle and why?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the situation of the product or the brand. When you're in a high growth stage and your product is accelerating, national scale really is not something you can beat because you can move quickly, you can drive in volume, you can really get the masses on board, and that's what you need to do to grow quickly. You want to be able to drive and pivot and make decisions and move the needle quickly. But once your product gets to a more mature state and you're in more of a saturated marketplace, or you're even coming into a harvest, then segmentation and localization, I think, becomes far more powerful, because then you're not competing with the scale of national on the first mile. You're really looking at what happens at the end. When you start to reach diminishing returns, how do you become more focused on finding those pockets of growth and really allowing yourself to bring new dimension to the brand, to the portfolio, on features that may not resonate with masses, but are extremely important to certain communities or certain customer sets. So I think there's a time and place for every part of the strategy. Sometimes I think we get frustrated when a business moves between cycles. One time you're really hot on local, another time you're really hot on national. And it may feel very schizophrenic, but I do think there's some strategy involved in terms of making sure that you're meeting the market where it is and you're meeting the business where it is operationally.
I got it. You used a word that I just keyed in on instantly because I've literally don't think I've ever heard it before. And that was harvest.
Yeah.
Never heard that term. Is that your term? Where did that come from?
Yeah, harvest to me is when you get to the point of saturation, maybe you're getting ready to introduce new product. There's a piece of that product that is still delivering value. You don't want to abandon that value, but you do want to moderate how much you're putting into it, right? Because you're really trying to manage the decline and modulate the growth as more so than trying to drive scale. And I do think it's important to understand when a product is in harvest, because you take an approach very differently and you invest in it very differently when you're managing a decline as compared to something that's new on the front end of growth acceleration.
Awesome. That's interesting. Thank you for the explanation.
Yeah, you're welcome.
But could you pick one that actually moves the needle of brand, local market, retail, digital, and growth? Is there any one that really moves the needle?
I'd say personalized and local. And especially in this environment, because we've gotten to a place where society really looks at the circle of me. You think about how we might think about our social media timelines and feeds. It really is a self-fulfilling prophecy of our own worldview. So my worldview looks very different than my husband's worldview. And we often have to make sure that we're on the same page, that we're not seeing the same thing. And I think that that's what makes personalization so powerful. Localization to me is just another form of segment of geography, right? And it really is a microcosm of how people define themselves. And so I think the ability to understand your consumer and start to play back in a way that is consistent with how they see themselves is the most successful way to drive growth in this environment.
Let me ask you, so if we're talking about localization in the United States, obviously East Coast is different than West Coast and the Bible Belt versus, the northern states and so forth. Wouldn't that be expensive? And are companies willing to go to that degree of budget to have to localize communications across the United States versus one big brand blanket?
Yeah, they're absolutely different. And this is where I think the role of technology can be very powerful if you figure out how to do it correctly, because it is expensive. To fragment yourself across a variety of segments becomes very costly if you're doing it with human capacity, if you're doing it with excessive versioning. That does become very difficult to manage and very cost intensive. And so what I think we see more often is either you pick a subset, you don't try to do everything and be everything to everybody, but you do go all in on a handful of things that you want to really bring your brand forward in places of growth, or you introduce technology to expand the scale of the humans. And I think that's part of what we have to think about as marketers is not fear it as a replacement of humans, but look at it as an opportunity to unlock more scale than what the humans can accomplish on their own.
Gotcha. Okay, interesting. So AI promises speed, scale, and optimization. Excuse me. What is quietly threatening to a race from modern marketing if we're not paying attention?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. So I guess I just take a step back. My background is in engineering. So I'm a little bit of an oddball, probably coming over more into the marketing and creative side. But what I think has been helpful and is going to serve marketers going forward when you think about where the things are headed is understanding the technology. Because if you're not participating in the training of the engine, the definition of the data sets that are going into these engines, it can be risky because the outcomes are going to be determined by the people who are training the models. And so if those people are not familiar with your worldview, your culture, your identity, then that's not going to be played back in how the model starts to define its new version of reality. So to me, that's a big watch out. I mean, ethics and, equality and this idea of how you play back someone's sense of self is going to be very, very important when you start to allow the technology to take a bigger role in defining the creative implementation, without sort of that human intervention that we start with today.
Right. I'm hearing a lot about human in the loop.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think we ever get away from humans in the loop. At the end of the day, the technology or the machine is only as good as the people who are training it until it gets, and at some point it does help and train us, but it starts somewhere with an objective, with an idea, with a data set, and then it grows from there. But the humans always got to be in the loop to check it, correct it, guide it, right? Push it back to center. And so I think that there's going to always be a role for humanity in the process. I just think the role is different.
That's awesome.
Especially in the creative environment, at the end of the day, you really do have some high touch areas where you want to have a huge amount of empathy, of authenticity, of human connection, but the ability to then train a model on what the human has created in that body of work and then extend it into something that's highly transactional, like we talked about earlier. That's not necessarily the work you want to pay a creative to do a high touch on a transactional message, but you can absolutely train an engine on what the human has created to apply it correctly to those, high volume activities.
Yeah, interesting. So with access to enormous amounts of data, how do you know when to trust the numbers and when to ignore them and back a creative gut call instead?
Yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of ways to measure things, that's for sure. And it can be very distracting, candidly. And what I would say is you have to know how the data is created as much as you look at the output of the data set. Because to me, that's when you know when you need to bring the experience along to help make that judgment call. If you know that the data set is created in a certain context or under certain circumstances, and those circumstances have changed, that gives you some good credence to be able to say, I might need to take my experience along here and take a structured risk. And I say structured risk intentionally because I don't think you ever abandon the data. I think you use it to inform, you bring experience along, and then you check your outcome. And if you're willing to check your outcome, that helps to make sure that the risk you're taking doesn't take you to a place where you can really put some risk involved in the ecosystem that is beyond what you can tolerate. Because then look, when you make a gut check, when you're going to be bold, when you're going to try something different, you're going to get it wrong sometimes.
Right.
And if you're not willing to accept that, you shouldn't take the experiment. And if you're not willing to measure it, you shouldn't take the experiment, because that's how you get to a place where you're iterating, you're really bringing and pushing the boundaries of creativity, and you start to actually have creativity that drives outcomes, not just excited feelings, right?
Yeah. So let me ask you. So let's just say we're gonna launch some kind of a campaign, and we have a data that says X. We execute against the data. The creative comes out. You're kind of unsure about it, right? Maybe it's breaking into some new territory. Are you a fan of creative testing?
I am a fan of creative testing. I think anytime you can get customer feedback, the better. Of course, it depends on how sensitive the launch is and the product is and the risk for competitive response. Sometimes you just have to place your bet. But just because you place your bet doesn't mean you can't make a change. I mean, we've seen a couple of brands do that with their creative launches recently, right? Where, look, I put out a new logo. The customers did not enjoy the change. They moved
Cracker
the
Barrel.
cheese too far. Yeah. Not going to say that. There's two prominent ones as of late, actually. Yeah, right? One that went all the way back, right? And one that's kind of trying to see it through. And I think at the end of the day, you have to listen to your customer, and the customer can kind of forgive you going out there, them hearing a response, and then you reframing it to make a change. That actually can be quite powerful, right? Because you're getting a lot of conversation, you're getting people emotionally involved in what you're doing, which to me is really important. You know, I like to say you're going to feel something. You should feel something. If you feel nothing, then we probably haven't done our job, right? So whether you love it or you hate it, the first step is to get you feeling. Right. Then we can deal with how we move the feelings in the right direction. But if you're feeling nothing, then you don't really have that staying power.
You know, it's funny. I almost think that's almost could become part of a really unique strategy of taking a brand, revising the logo, just because it tends to touch off such a firestorm amongst the community, especially for a brand that had, like I mentioned Cracker Barrel, you know, they weren't part of the conversation for years. But all of a sudden, they became top of mind for everybody. It almost feels like it could be an incredible opportunity for a brand just to get attention again, to get media and conversation started, and then come back at their community with the most amazing, you know, effort to bring the brand into that new space, right? Almost as a community-led sort of thing. It feels like done right, it could be a real powerful tool, but done wrong, obviously, we've seen what happens there, right?
That's right. And look, it's a very expensive proposition, but I think back to when I was younger and M&M's launched the color campaign. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Were you part of that? I voted for blue. For what it's worth, I voted for blue. But, you know, it was a really interesting way to get people involved in something that they probably were not talking about. And they felt like you were a part of it. And it felt like if your color was the one that actually got launched into the package, that somehow you were, made that happen.
Right.
And I think now more than ever, people like to feel like they're a part of making something happen, right? Of being heard through the brand.
Yeah, because we love our brands. Okay, what's the most common smart marketing idea you see today that you believe is actually making brands more forgettable?
You know, I actually think hyper-personalization is one of those things. I think that there's a role for it. I think it's very important, but you could also get to a point where you're so fragmented on what you stand for that there's no common ground on what you stand for. And I don't think we should ever lose the common ground on what you want people to feel or what you want to stand for at the macro level of your brand. So to me, that's a watch out one. I think it could be used very effectively, can really help you optimize and drive efficient revenue, but it's not a replacement for how people see the macro order of your brand.
Interesting. Okay, as marketing leaders are increasingly held accountable for revenue, what creative risks are actually worth taking now that would have been career limiting 10 years ago?
I think the use of AI. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we have to think about the accountability of revenue also with the accountability of profitability. And so you really don't get the benefit of the revenue if you're not operationally sound and driving profitable revenue growth, because all revenue growth is not great revenue growth. And so I think the use of AI is going to be an area that we can't be afraid of. And we have to really experiment with, even though it's going to be sensitive. It's going to be a little crunchy in the middle. I think it's going to be maybe displace some things that we feel very passionately about. But I do think that's the bet to place, because it will help you drive more efficient operations. But like we talked about, it's really about what does the role of the human become, and how do we get in front of training that so that there is that role and that balance that's taking place, but not participating in an environment where every company is trying to find that silver bullet is just going to leave you behind.
Right. So you're saying that you'd be comfortable taking the risks in AI, creativity or sales funnel enablement?
AI generation, selection of audience, AI generated creative in some ways. Like, how do we push the boundaries on that? Look, it's not where it needs to be today, but how will it ever get there if we're not experimenting with it, if we're not coaching it, right? I think you start to try and then you say, no, that's not what I wanted. You keep trying and pushing the boundary on that technology so it can learn to get to a place where it can give you an outcome that you find acceptable.
Right.
So I think we can't be afraid of that. I think right now it's a little bit, it's not mature enough. So people can spot it. There's a lot of mistrust associated with it. So we've not really, I think, found the right path for it yet, but I do think there is a path and we just have to experiment.
Okay. So if you were starting your marketing career today, AI everywhere, attention nowhere, what would you obsess over learning that most marketers are still underestimating?
I would say probably two things that are very opposite. I would obsess over understanding technology. So I would not advise a marketer today that's coming into the business to focus solely on creative and not bring the technical acumen, the business acumen alongside. I think it's even more important than it was years ago. So I think it's something you really got to be focused on and thinking about early in the career. But I'd also say human connection, which is all the way on the other side. Because I do think at the end of the day, when you can get to the place of irrational love, people will do amazing things. And, some of the things, if you think of yourself as a buyer that you might buy, we just had holiday here. There are some things that I bought. I'm not even sure why I bought them. But in the moment, they made me feel really excited about, the reaction I was going to get from the person I was gifting it to. Even if that person was myself, by the way. So I think there's a place still for human connection and, that sort of ability to invoke irrational love around your brand that is going to be even more critical than it has been in the past, because a lot of people aren't paying attention to it anymore. Right. Everyone's focused on how do you get hyper efficient? How does the technology just run the ship? So if you can kind of keep some of that connection going, it's going to be a little bit of something I think people are satiating for.
Yeah. I love that term you just used, irrational love. I love that. That's great. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with a little retail therapy.
There it is. Yeah.
Okay, so now is the most exciting time in the show. We're going to go into the lightning round where I have questions for you. Give me the first thought that comes to your mind. No debate. You don't have to defend it. Just let us know what you're thinking. Okay.
Okay.
All right? No one's going to argue with you. One word to describe marketing in 2025, and one word you wish would disappear from marketing decks forever.
Well, for sure, the brief. That's not brief. Marketing in 2025.
One word.
A little scared.
Okay, that's fair. I don't blame you. Better superpower for a marketer, perfect data or perfect taste? But you can't have both.
Perfect taste.
What's the first slide you secretly judge in a marketing presentation?
The opener. If I can't get what I need in the beginning, then it's probably too long for me.
Tough crowd. Okay. What metric do executives love that marketers quietly hate?
Efficiency.
Biggest lie marketing tells itself during annual planning season?
We'll be on budget.
Right? Okay. Brand purpose, essential North Star or wildly overused Mad Lib?
Essential North Star.
What's more dangerous? We need to be bold, or let's test it first.
Bold. Can't be afraid to test.
The most overused phrase in modern marketing meetings.
Breakthrough.
AI in marketing right now feels more like a magic wand, a power tool, or a loaded weapon.
Magic wand. I don't think people understand it yet.
Okay. What's a marketing trend everyone is chasing that you'd happily sit out?
Trying to be alpha, Gen Alpha. Every brand's not Gen Alpha. Got to be okay with that.
Yeah, I like it. What actually breaks through today? Emotional storytelling, utility, humor, or surprise, and you can only pick one. Emotional storytelling, utility, humor, or surprise.
Surprise.
Okay. Which channel do marketers pretend they understand, but actually don't?
Creators.
I agree with you. The best creative insight you've ever seen that came from data, or a human saying something unexpected?
The best phrase I heard that I keep repeating is that a brand is a series of promises kept.
Okay. What's the fastest way for a brand to become invisible, even with a massive media budget?
Do everything that everyone else is doing.
Finish this sentence. If marketers were braver about blank, brands would win more.
Authenticity.
Okay. Well, there we have it. That was the end of the lightning round. You scored 472 points.
Yes.
Sadly, not enough to take the top prize and the vacation to Hawaii. You were just shy of it, which is too bad.
I'm very competitive. I want to play again.
Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and sharing your insights. I've loved your answers. I know our viewers will as well. And it's been such a pleasure meeting you and having this chance to chat.
Thank you so much, Russell. I'm honored to have been a part of this conversation and really enjoyed the time together.
Awesome. Well, take care.
Thank you. Bye.